Novel Stream presents A Voyage to Sfanomoë by Clark Ashton Smith. There are many marvelous tales, untold, unwritten, never to be recorded or remembered, lost beyond all divining and all imagining, that sleep in the double silence of far-recessive time and space. The chronicles of Saturn, the archives of the moon in its prime, the legends of Antalya and Moria, these are full of an unsurmised or forgotten wonder. And strange are the multitudinous tales withheld by the light years of Polaris and the galaxy. But none is stranger, none more marvelous, than the tale of Hotar and Evidon and their voyage to the planet Sfanomoë, from the last isle of foundering Atlantis. Hearken, for I alone shall tell the story, who came in a dream to the changeless center where the past and future are always contemporary with the present, and saw the veritable happening thereof, and, waking, gave it words. Hotar and Evidon were brothers in science as well as by consanguinity. They were the last representatives of a long line of illustrious inventors and investigators, all of whom had contributed more or less to the knowledge, wisdom, and scientific resources of a lofty civilization matured through cycles. One by one, they and their fellow savants had learned the arcanic secrets of geology, of chemistry, of biology, of astronomy. They had subverted the elements, had constrained the sea, the sun, the air, and the force of gravitation, compelling them to serve the uses of man. And lastly, they had found a way to release the typhonic power of the atom, to destroy, transmute, and reconstruct the molecules of matter at will. However, by that irony which attends all the triumphs and achievements of man, the progress of this mastering of natural law was coincidental with the profound geologic changes and upheavals which caused the gradual sinking of Atlantis. Age by age, eon by eon, the process had gone on. Huge peninsulas, whole seaboards, high mountain ranges, citied plains and plateaus, all went down in turn beneath the diluvial waves. With the advance of science, the time and location of future cataclysms was more accurately predictable, but nothing could be done to avert them. In the days of Hotar and Evidon, all that remained of the former continent was a large isle, called Poseidonis. It was well known that this isle, with its opulent seaports, its eon-surviving monuments of art and architecture, its fertile inland valleys, and mountains lifting their spires of snow above semi-tropic jungles, was destined to go down ere the sons and daughters of the present generation had grown to maturity. Like many others of their family, Hotar and Evidon had devoted long years of research to the obscure telluric laws governing the imminent catastrophe, and had sought to devise a means of prevention, or, at least, of retardation. But the seismic forces involved were too deeply seated and too widespread in their operation to be controllable in any manner or degree. No magnetic mechanism, no zone of repressive force was powerful enough to affect them. When the two brothers were nearing middle age, they realized the ultimate futility of their endeavors, and though the peoples of Poseidonis continued to regard them as possible saviors, whose knowledge and resource were well-nigh superhuman, they had secretly abandoned all effort to salvage the doomed isle, and had retired from sea-gazing Lefara, the immemorial home of their family, to a private observatory and laboratory far up in the mountains of the interior. Here, with the hereditary wealth at their command, the brothers surrounded themselves not only with all the known instruments and materials of scientific endeavor, but also with a certain degree of personal luxury. They were secluded from the world by 100 scarps and precipices, and by many leagues of little-trodden jungle, and they deemed this seclusion advisable for the labors which they now proposed to themselves, and whose real nature they had not divulged to anyone. Hotar and Evidon had gone beyond all others of their time in the study of astronomy. The true character and relationship of the world, the sun, the moon, the planetary system, and the stellar universe had long been known in Atlantis. But the brothers had speculated more boldly, had calculated more profoundly and more closely than anyone else. In the powerful magnifying mirrors of their observatory, They had given special attention to the neighboring planets, had formed an accurate idea of their distance from the Earth, had estimated their relative size, and had conceived the notion that several, or perhaps all, might well be inhabited by creatures similar to man, or, if not inhabited, were potentially capable of supporting human life. Venus, which the Atlanteans knew by the name of Sfanomoë, was the planet which drew their curiosity and their conjecture more than any other. Because of its position, they surmised that it might readily resemble the Earth in climatic conditions and in all the prerequisites of biological development. And the hidden labor to which they were now devoting their energies was nothing less than the invention of a vehicle by which it would be possible to leave the ocean-threatened isle and voyage to Sfanomoë. Day by day the brothers toiled to perfect their invention, and night by night, through the ranging seasons, they peered at the lustrous orb of their speculations as it hung in the emerald evening of Poseidonis, or above the violet-shrouded heights that would soon take the saffron footprints of the dawn. And ever they gave themselves to bolder imaginings, to stranger and more perilous projects. The vehicle they were building was designed with complete foreknowledge of all the problems to be faced, of all the difficulties to be overcome. Various types of air vessels had been used in Atlantis for epochs, but they knew that none of these would be suitable for their purpose even in a modified form. The vehicle they finally devised, after much planning and long discussion, was a perfect sphere, like a miniature moon, since, as they argued, all bodies traveling through etheric space were of this shape. It was made with double walls of a metallic alloy, whose secret they themselves had discovered, an alloy that was both light and tough beyond any substance classified by chemistry or mineralogy. There were a dozen small round windows lined with an unbreakable glass, and a door of the same alloy as the walls, that could be shut with hermetic tightness. The explosion of atoms in sealed cylinders was to furnish the propulsive and levitative power, and would also serve to heat the sphere's interior against the absolute cold of space. Solidified air was to be carried in electrum containers and vaporized at the rate which would maintain a respirable atmosphere. And foreseeing that the gravitational influence of the Earth would lessen and cease as they went further and further away from it, they had established in the floor of the sphere a magnetic zone that would simulate the effect of gravity, and thus obviate any bodily danger or discomfort to which they might otherwise be liable. These labors were carried on with no other assistance than that of a few slaves, members of an aboriginal race of Atlantis, who had no conception of the purpose for which the vessel was being built, and who, to ensure their complete discretion, were deaf mutes. There were no interruptions from visitors, for it was tacitly assumed throughout the isle that Hotar and Evidon were engaged in seismologic researches that required a concentration both profound and prolonged. At length, after years of toil, of vacillation, doubt, anxiety, the sphere was completed. Shining like an immense bubble of silver, it stood on a westward-facing terrace of the laboratory, from which the planet Sfanomoë was now visible at eventide beyond the purpling sea of the jungle. All was in readiness. The vessel was amply provisioned for a journey of many lustrums and decades, and was furnished with an abundant supply of books, with implements of art and science, with all things necessary for the comfort and convenience of the voyagers. Hotar and Evidon were now men of middle years, in the hale maturity of all their powers and faculties. They were the highest type of the Atlantean race, with fair complexions and lofty stature, with the features of a lineage both aristocratic and intellectual. Knowing the nearness of the final cataclysm, they had never married, they had not even formed any close ties, but had given themselves to science with a monastic devotion. They mourned the inevitable passing of their civilization, with all its epoch-garnered lore, its material and artistic wealth, its consummate refinement. But they had learned the universality of the laws whose operation was plunging Atlantis beneath the wave, the laws of change, of increase and decay, and they had schooled themselves to a philosophically resignation, a resignation which, mayhap, was not untempered by a foresight of the singular glory and novel, unique experiences that would be entailed by their flight upon hitherto untraveled space. Their emotions, therefore, were a mingling of altruistic regret and personal expectancy, when, on the evening chosen for their departure, they dismissed their wondering slaves with a writ of manumission, and entered the orb-shaped vessel. And Sfanomoë brightened before them with a pulsing luster, and Poseidonis darkened below, as they began their voyage into the sea-green heavens of the west. The great vessel rose with a buoyant ease beneath their guidance, till soon they saw the lights of Susran the capital and its galley-crowded port Lefara, where nightly revels were held, and the very fountains ran with wine that people might forget a while the predicted doom. But so high in the air had the vessel climbed that Hotar and Evidon could hear no faintest murmur of the loud lyres and strident merrymaking in the cities beneath. And they went onward and upward, till the world was a dark blur and the skies were aflame with stars that their optic mirrors had never revealed. And anon the black planet below was rimmed with a growing crescent of fire, and they soared from its shadow to unsettling daylight. But the heavens were no longer a familiar blue, but had taken on the lucid ebon of ether, and no star nor world, not even the littlest, was dimmed by the rivalry of the sun. And brighter than all was Sfanomoë, where it hung with unvacillating lambents in the void. Mile by stellar mile the earth was left behind, and Hotar and Evidon, peering ahead to the goal of their dreams, had almost forgotten it. Then, gazing back, they saw it was no longer below but above them, like a vaster moon. And studying its oceans and isles and continents, they named them over one by one from their maps as the globe revolved. But vainly they sought for Poseidonis, amid an unbroken glittering waste of sea. And the brothers were conscious of that regret and sorrow which is the just due of all evanished beauty, of all sunken splendor. And they mused a while on the glory that had been Atlantis, and recalled to memory her obelisks and domes and mountains, her palms with high and haughty crests, and the fire-tall plumes of her warriors that would lift no longer to the sun. Their life in the orb-like vessel was one of ease and tranquility, and differed little from that to which they were accustomed. They pursued their wonted studies. They went on with experiments they had planned or begun in past days. They read to each other the classic literature of Atlantis. They argued and discussed a million problems of philosophy or science. And time itself was scarcely heeded by Hotar and Evidon, and the weeks and months of their journey became years, and the years were added into lustrums, and the lustrums into decades. Nor were they sensible of the change in themselves and in each other, as the years began to weave a web of wrinkles in their faces, to tint their brows with the yellow ivory of age, and to thread their sable beards with ermine. There were too many things to be solved or debated, too many speculations and surmises to be ventured, for such trivial details as these to usurp their attention. Sfanomoë grew larger and larger as the half-oblivious years went by, till anon it rolled beneath them with strange markings of untraveled continents and seas unsailed by man. And now the discourse of Hotar and Evidon was wholly concerning the world in which they would so soon arrive, and the peoples, animals, and plants which they might expect to find. They felt in their ageless hearts the thrill of an anticipation without parallel, as they steered their vessel toward the ever-widening orb that swam below them. Soon they hung above its surface, in a cloud-laden atmosphere of tropic warmth. But though they were childishly eager to set foot on the new planet, they sagely decided to continue their journey on a horizontal level till they could study its topography with some measure of care and precision. To their surprise, they found nothing in the bright expanse below that in any manner suggested the work of men or living beings. They had looked for towering cities of exotic aerial architecture, for broad thoroughfares and canals and geometrically measured areas of agricultural fields. Instead, there was only a primordial landscape of mountains, marshes, forests, oceans, rivers, and lakes. At length they made up their minds to descend. Though they were old, old men with 5-foot ermine beards. They brought the moon-shaped vessel down with all the skill of which they had been capable in their prime, and opening the door that had been sealed for decades, they emerged in turn, Hotar preceding Evidon, since he was a little the elder. Their first impressions were of a torrid heat, of dazzling color and overwhelming perfume. There seemed to be a million odors in the heavy, strange, unstirring air odors that were almost visible in the form of breathing vapors, perfumes that were like elixirs and opiates, that conferred at the same time a blissful drowsiness and a divine exhilaration. Then they saw that there were flowers everywhere, that they had descended in a wilderness of blossoms. They were all of unearthly form, of supermundane size and beauty and variety, with scrolls and volutes of petals many-hued, that seemed to curl and twist with a more than vegetable animation or sentiency. They grew from a ground that their overlapping stems and calyxes had utterly concealed. They hung from the boles and fronds of palm-like trees they had mantled beyond recognition. They thronged the water of still pools. They poised on the jungle tops like living creatures winged for flight to the perfume-drunken heavens. And even as the brothers watched, the flowers grew and faded with a thaumaturgic swiftness. They fell and replaced each other as if by some legerdemain of natural law. Hotar and Evidon were delighted. They called out to each other like children. They pointed at each new floral marvel that was more exquisite and curious than the rest. And they wondered at the speed of their miraculous growth and decay. And they laughed at the unexampled bizarrerie of the sight when they perceived certain animals new to zoology, who were trotting about on more than the usual number of legs, with orchidaceous blossoms springing from their rumps. They forgot their long voyage through space. They forgot there had ever been a planet called the Earth and an isle named Poseidonis. They forgot their lore and their wisdom as they roamed through the bowers of Sfanomoë. The exotic air and its odors mounted to their heads like a mighty wine, and the clouds of golden and snowy pollen which fell upon them from the arching arbors were potent as some fantastic drugs. It pleased them that their white beards and violet tunics should be powdered with this pollen, and with the floating spores of plants that were alien to all terrene botany. Suddenly Hotar cried out with a new wonder and laughed with a more boisterous mirth than before. He had seen that an oddly folded leaf was starting from the back of his shrunken right hand. The leaf unfurled as it grew. It disclosed a flower bud, and lo! The bud opened and became a triple-chaliced blossom of unearthly hues, adding a rich perfume to the swooning air. Then, on his left hand, another blossom appeared in like manner, and then leaves and petals were burgeoning from his wrinkled face and brow, were growing in successive tiers from his limbs and body, were mingling their hair-like tendrils and tongue-shaped pistils with his beard. He felt no pain, only an infantile surprise and bewilderment as he watched them. Now from the hands and limbs of Evidon, the blossoms also began to spring, and soon the two old men had ceased to wear a human semblance, and were hardly to be distinguished from the garland-laden trees about them. And they died with no agony, as if they were already part of the teeming floral life of Sfanomoë, with such perceptions and sensations as were appropriate to their new mode of existence. And before long, their metamorphosis was complete, and every fiber of their bodies had undergone a dissolution into flowers, and the vessel in which they had made their voyage was embowered from sight in an ever-climbing mass of plants and blossoms. Such was the fate of Hotar and Evidon, the last of the Atlanteans, and the first, if not also the last, of human visitors to Sfanomoë. Thank you for listening.